resign before I get tried by a criminal court. But see, if I gave that impression, I wasn't being clear. I don't think these are vacuous concepts, and I don't think they're just subjective. I think they're very clear, reasonably clear concepts. Not clear like quantum physics, but reasonably clear. International law is reasonably clear. For example, when the World Court reached its decision condemning the United States for international terrorism, it had good grounds and a solid argument, runs through hundreds of pages if you read it. The U.S. knew that it was a solid argument. That's why the U.S. refused to accept the jurisdiction of the court. And yes, that was pretty clear. It wasn't vacuous. Same with terrorism. If I didn't make it clear, let me say it now. I think the definition given in the U.S. Code and U.S. Army manuals is the right definition. I've always accepted it. The definition that I quoted, I think, is exactly the right definition. Okay, it doesn't answer every imaginable question. You can have a philosophy seminar or you can make up cases where it doesn't deal with. But in the real world, it covers almost everything. There's nothing subjective about it. The point is that it cannot be accepted because of its consequences. Its consequences tell us that we're doing terrible things, and therefore we don't accept it. I mean, the Nazis weren't carrying out counter-terror. They were carrying out terror. I mean, they called it counter-terror, and the U.S. military agreed with them, but for their own reasons. We don't have to accept that. It's not a vacuous, subjective concept. That's true of, if you're a lawyer, so you know better than I do. I mean, the legal system does not apply trivially to every situation that comes up. That's why judges have to think. But nevertheless, it's a framework. Sometimes you think it's a wrong framework, so you change the laws. But it's a framework. And the same is true of international law. And the same is true of terrorism, and the same is true of peace.
Perhaps I overstated the moral relativism of your position. But what I was trying to get at was the fact that the World Court, other UN organizations or institutions that the United States did a major role in creating, and have a major role in shaping how they define the language, the discourse of justice. If that's the case, and you see these institutions can't hold up in the face of something that affects the United States, or change their stances in the face of what affects the United States, then what would you do in that situation? You were President of the United States. Understanding you have a political imperative to see first.
Well, see, if I can restate your question, let's put it this, see if I get it wrong. Suppose you're the president of the leading terrorist state in the world, and the World Court condemns you for terrorism and orders you to stop, and the Security Council tries to pass a resolution calling on you to observe international law and you veto it, then what do you do as president of the United States? Well, you don't try to change the World Court. You don't try to change the UN. You stop your terrorism. Pardon? Sorry?
Is that your invocation to all of us here to rally for them to stop specific acts?
Well, you figure out what you think is there. I'm not telling you. Look, I think it's the wrong thing to do the plans that they are now announcing is their plans. Their assumptions are that what they're doing may very well kill a couple of million innocent people in Afghanistan. Okay, I happen to think that's wrong. If somebody else thinks it's right, okay. I think it's wrong, terribly wrong, in fact, monstrous, and I think we should do something about it.
Thank you.
I just need to let you know we'll have one more question on this side and one more on that side, and then we'll be finished.
George from Revolution Books and the Revolutionary Worker newspaper. And I take it back personally to what the U.S. did to declare the American century in the sense of bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were in no way military targets, but served a certain purpose in declaring we're here, the United States Empire is here, basically. I see this in a sense of continuation of that clearly it's not about justice, about ending the threat to innocent human beings, it's about extending that. But I think the challenge...
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, why don't you get to it, because we don't have a lot of time.
All right, no. We've got quite a bit of time in the sentence, because they're talking about going from Afghanistan maybe to Iraq. So I think we've got time.
No, we don't have time tonight.
Some
other time.
Yeah. So, in terms of tonight, here's my question. I'm happy to see 2,000 people there. My question to each and everyone here, what are we prepared to do to resist this war, to go out and bring this conversation to people broadly? And I salute the people who've been at marches the last 2 weeks, but in no way have these marches and rallies represented a degree of opposition. I think we need to break through the intimidation factor, break through the terms of discourse, redirect people's questions and discourse around it. I think there's an opening to do that. That's where I agree with you, Noam. There's a very huge opening.
So, okay, we're in agreement. So what are we talking about?
Let's debate about what can actually be done.
Fine, that's a great idea. Let's form organizations. Let's do all the things we all know how to do when we want to change policy. I mean, anyone who agrees that the policy is wrong, it's a country, I mean, the intimidation factor, we should not even mention that. I mean, considering what people face around the world, the kind of intimidation that we face is so minuscule that it's embarrassing even to talk about it. We've got opportunities that nobody has, and we can use them.
You often talk about the responsibility for what's going on in the world and how we have responsibility. But what's often not addressed, and I just want to find out why we can blame our government, we can blame those people, but there's often, think tanks that are not part of our government, not part of, huge corporations, like, for instance, the Council on Foreign Relations, that handles a lot of, thought on foreign policy, and it's behind a lot of these atrocities. And I personally think that they're very responsible. And often they're not very much addressed as having the responsibility.
Well, look, I mean, there are lots of powerful institutions, and we can't talk now about the way the system is organized, but we all know there's a lot of concentrated power. Okay, and that means that the choice of action is determined often in secret in terms of interests of those powers and so on. Yeah, we know that, and we should. How do we deal with it? Well, two levels. One level is long-term level. Try to erode the concentrated power and make the country more free and democratic. Okay, that's one long-term objective. What do you do in a particular case? You're not going to save a couple of million Afghans by trying to dismantle the Council on Foreign Relations or corporations or anything else. We have, with all the concentration of power and centralization of authority, it still is true that there's a tremendous range of action open to us, which can influence policy within these structures. That would be true even if it was a totalitarian state. It's certainly true in a more free and democratic society. So fine, let's use the opportunities that are available, and long-term objective, let's try to broaden them.
Often there's situations like, for instance, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Lumumba, you mentioned before, where they try to organize people to oppose, or change policy. You know what they are.
Yeah, and I can't blame that on the Council of Foreign Relations. You're too young, so I can't blame you. But I can blame people like me who were alive then. We didn't have to let Lumumba get assassinated. I mean, it happens in this case that it's mostly Belgium that's responsible. And they, fortunately, after many years, are finally conducting an inquiry into their own atrocity and involvement in the Lumumba assassination. But the U.S. was in the background there, and it could have been stopped. And the same with other things. You want to blame the Council on Foreign Relations, fine. But the first place to look is always in the mirror. First place. Okay, after you've decided I've done everything I possibly can, you can start blaming somebody else. Pardon? The real people behind it?
The small coups, like the old families, the old wealth, that fund all these think tanks.
Yeah, there's a serious maldistribution of power internal to the country, and we ought to try to do something about that. That's a long-term objective. We always ought to be thinking about it.
On behalf of the 2,000 people listening here at MIT and the many others listening on the World Wide Web, I'd like to thank Professor Chomsky for being with us today.
if you're not familiar with the American Cultures Forum, this is an opportunity for all of us to explore different aspects of American culture, American society. It is an open forum which is typically generated by students, student demand, student. In the past, people have asked for a whole host of different presentations coming from different cultural situations having to do with Native American populations, different ethnic types of presentations, also different religious presentations having to do with Islam, with just a host of different religions. We also spend a lot of time, though, on political presentations, and one of the things that is quite clear to us right now, obviously in the current set of conditions, is that by virtue of the attack we had on the World Trade Towers and Pentagon building just this last week, that there is a great degree of global political ignorance about the causes, background, and reasons for these things. I was fortunate enough to have students approach me with a request to bring a noted expert in the field, Dr. Michael Parenti, to come and speak with us tonight on globalization, on the concept of an American economic empire overseas, and hopefully we can request some information on the concept of economic imperialism, economic terrorism. One of the things that's been happening on this campus, if you haven't noticed, I've been involved in today. I was in a panel earlier today, and we did a televised broadcast today also. We've been dealing with the issues of why and how things like what happened last week could have happened, but also what we've been dealing with is our responses to it. And one of the things people have asked me over and over again is, what can we do about the type of events which occurred? Can we find ways to feel secure? And there is a whole host of reactionary responders who seem to think the only way to solve violence is with some other form of violence. We've been speaking out as a faculty, as an administration, and as generally as a student body against violence for violence sake, against reprisals which may be domestic or foreign, because as we've seen, these type of responses, these type of short-term, knee-jerk, and typically reactionary solutions only bring with them more violence. One of the things I've been trying to advocate for is a root or radical solution. Radical, the original word meaning root. Meaning what we have to do is look at the causes of the impression which Americans leave overseas. We have to look at the reasons that generate sets of conditions which have caused situations like what happened last week to occur. We have to look at our own foreign policy, our own economic policy, and levels of culpability, levels of responsibility which we hold for that. And if we're going to change the conditions which create fear and climates of terror, what we're going to need to do is work as a concept of a global community with global responsibilities as opposed to global exploitation. Along those lines, some of the information which you may be able to receive from reading Dr. Parenti's books would be very, very useful for this. I myself am in the process of reading Dirty Truths right now. Some of you may have read Against Empire. And there will be a couple of new books coming out. One is History as Mystery, and the other is To Kill a Nation, The Attack on Yugoslavia, which may be something you might want to pick up. Let me mention those titles again for you by Dr. Parenti so that you can be looking for them in City Lights Bookstore and other places. History as Mystery would be one title, and the other would be To Kill a Nation, The Attack on Yugoslavia. The information you can find in those books will help you to understand the levels of global responsibility which the United States government has, the levels of economic influence which the United States people carry, and the fact that we, in certain ways, vote on the prosperity of other nations by where we buy our clothing and how we spend our money. It's important to realize that our prosperity typically is bought at the expense of other groups of people around the world. And as it's very important to realize, our responsibility doesn't simply end when we put down some U.S. dollars for some goods, but the impact of how we spend our money, the impact of how we allow our corporations to operate overseas is something that is directly proportionate to the quality of life of other individuals around the world. With those things in mind, with a whole host of questions which you might have, remember to write them down, there'll be a chance to ask them later on. With a whole host of questions I would like to ask Dr. Parenti, let me waste no further time in actually introducing Dr. Michael Parenti.
see here. I'm going to try to... Can you hear me now? Is that better? Can you turn this up at all? No,
I don't know, not from here.
yeah, okay. That's all right. Anyway, you gave most of the lecture already, Al, so I don't have too much more to say. But I do want to say that I know for many of you, September 11 is a date that will live in your memory, and it certainly has been living in my memory for almost 30 years. It was on September 11, 1973, that U.S.-backed military in Chile overthrew the Chilean democracy, which was a democratic coalition government headed by Salvador Allende, Dr. Salvador Allende, and about 30,000 people were killed in that coup over a period of about several years. Another 100,000 were driven into exile or arrested, tortured, and thousands more disappeared, never accounted for, never showed up. Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of State, and Richard Nixon, who was President, were the people who really were very much behind that coup. That was an act of momentous terror. It was a terrorism. Death squads were used, people were dragged out of their houses, people were put up against the wall in the stadiums and summarily executed. That's terrorism at work. And so it has been in the last half century that U.S. leaders, I don't say the United States, and I don't say we go in, we do this, and we go do that. I go, wait a minute, we pay the taxes, we get screwed over, we get drafted, or we have to go in the army. It's they who do this. U.S. leaders have intervened directly with force and violence. The terror bombing of El Chileo neighborhoods in Panama City. How many people have heard about it? Not that much, because the media didn't really give it the kind of play that you would get. 3,000 people killed there in Panama City when George I invaded Panama. The 2 million people who have died in Angola with the CIA-supported UNITA, war of attrition against Angola. The almost 1 million who died in Mozambique, again with these terror squads called Renamo, is the headline, the abbreviated title. It's not an acronym really, and again supported by U.S. forces. The 1 million people who were killed in the military coup in Indonesia, which overthrew Sukarno, a military that was trained, equipped, advised, and whose salaries were even paid by the CIA and the U.S. State Department and such. So there have been these acts of mass murder. Now, the American people know very little of that. Very little of that gets even reported. The Indonesia massacre, in fact, wasn't even reported until several months later, and it got a box like this in Time magazine, and one story in the New York Times with an editorial applauding the military and saying that's very good, that's a stabilizing thing. And in Nicaragua, the U.S.-backed troops who went in there and hit what they called soft targets, which were farming cooperatives, schools, community houses, granaries, energy stations, housing projects, just hit them and killing people and terrorizing, spreading terror and disillusion, disabling and destabilizing these countries. Rios Montt. Now this is, by the way, what I'm telling you is all a matter of public record. Rios Montt in Guatemala, who went with the Guatemalan army, that maddened, insane murder machine called the Guatemalan army, and President Clinton last year, you remember, 2 years ago, even went and apologized to Guatemala and said, we're sorry for our role when Rios Montt went in there and wiped out 600 Mayan villages, 600 of them, 200,000 people, men, women, and children, killed every single one of them in sight. And Clinton actually apologized and said, I feel your pain, I'm sorry. He didn't explain why was the U.S. supporting this thug and this terrorizer and this murderer. Why are we hated throughout the Middle East after we bombed Somalia and killed 10,000 people with a military intervention? Compliments of George I and Clinton who continued it. Why are we hated throughout Latin America? It's not just the Middle East. You can go through Latin America, you can go through other parts of the world, Pacific world, Pacific Basin, and you'll find people who will see the United States as intervening everywhere. Intervening either directly with their own troops, as in Grenada, Panama, Somalia, Iraq, Yugoslavia. I was in Yugoslavia in the summer of 1999 after Clinton's 76 days of bombing around the clock. You want to talk about terror? You could see it. This is not, by the way, this is not to justify or excuse what happened in New York, which was a horrible thing. But that's the point. The horror has come home. And we can see suddenly what other people have been going through, not with a plane going into a building, but with carpet bombing, with knocking out bridges in the Danube River, depleted uranium in the Danube River, which is a source of drinking water for millions of people. The cancer cases. The next year I went to Iraq and I saw children with cancer. They said the cancer, the leukemia rate among children has just skyrocketed, especially in southern Iraq around Basra and there. And to see these kids in these hospitals is one of the most heartbreaking things. From the terror bombing of U.S. and NATO forces in Iraq, spreading out that depleted uranium and everything else. They said we never had a high cancer rate in this country until that happened. All of that is terror. And so, but you see, our media doesn't tell us that. Our media tells us that we are an innocent nation. We are an American nation who has been holding out a helping hand to people all over the world. And now these forces of evil hate us. They hate us because we love freedom. Well, I think the people are rather innocent. I think they're innocent of what their leaders do in their name. And I think maybe it's time that we wake up, because the first condition of a democratic citizenry is to have a critical view of what's going on. I remember during the Gulf War, a student saying to me, well, this is the difference between you and me. Yeah, it's not very pretty what's happening there. They are destroying a lot of things. But I have my faith in President Bush. I place my faith in President Bush. That was the first Bush. Bush the first. George the first he was talking about. And I said, he said, I trust President Bush. I said, what do you mean you have your faith? You have faith in President Bush? Faith? What are we doing? Religion here or politics? Do you have faith the way my Italian grandma had faith in St. Anthony? She used to go, oh, my God. You go, oh, Georgie Bush, God bless. You light a candle to him? Or what are you talking about? Faith. What do you mean you trust? Trust, which is something where you put your interest in someone else's hands, something you do only with very close friends and loved ones. And even them, check them out once in a while, right? That's what trust is about. But democracy is about distrust. Democracy is about accountability. Democracy is about exposure. It's about political competition. It's about debate. It's about showing us what are the reasons you're doing this. What are the reasons you want another 20 billion for this, another 20 billion for that? What are the reasons you want to tax us even more and tax us even more? For what? What are the reasons you want to send American boys and girls now over to this country or that country or the other country? What's the reason that we have 350 military bases all over the world? Why do we have our fleet making port in about 40 different countries? Why are we militarizing outer space now with new forms of weaponry we hope will be able to attack and immobilize whole populations? With new electromagnetic weapons and all this sort of thing. Why are they doing that? Why are we training and supplying and financing the troops and the paramilitaries and the police of scores and scores of other nations? Is it because to guard them from attacking each other? No, El Salvador wasn't going to invade Guatemala. Guatemala wasn't going to invade Nicaragua. Nicaragua wasn't going to invade Honduras. No, it was to arm them to the teeth to keep their own people under the heel of those client state rulers. Well, why would we do that? Why are those U.S. leaders doing that? I would argue that it's not, as they say, to protect democracy in these countries. In some cases, they overthrew democracies. I already gave you an example in Chile in 1973, in Guatemala in 1954, in Haiti under Father Aristide. Death squads killing Haitians. A popular movement the people mobilizing themselves for something better. That's not what U.S. policy is about. Because George Bush and his friends and Bill Clinton and his friends do not represent the interests of the American people. They represent the interests of the transnational corporations. Their goal is to make the world safe for the Fortune 500, to prevent competing forms of political economic governance. They prevent countries or movements or organizations develop that say, we want to use the land and the labor and the capital and the natural resources of our country for our collective development, for ourselves. And we don't want to leave this open and leave it as just so much raw material for you guys to come in, take as you want, your agribusiness firms, your banks, your investors, your whatever else. Well, that really is what it is about, I would say. Because you can look and you can see there are dictators. And the U.S. opposes some of them, but also loves others. When Fidel Castro took over in Cuba and formed what he thought was a popular dictatorship, he was asked, do you have freedom of the press? He said, no, we don't really. You're not free in Cuba to preach capitalism, racism, sexism, or imperialism, or those things. We do have a controlled press. Why don't you have our capitalist point of view in here in Cuba? He said, well, we get all your stations from Miami anyway, but we'll be happy to put your viewpoint on our official television when you would make time and put our viewpoint on your television. Well, we can't do that because we have a free and independent press. Right. Okay, so we are told that we must oppose Cuba because Fidel Castro is a dictator. But wait a minute. Before Fidel Castro took power in 1959, there had been 20 years of rule by a dictator. His name was Batista. Batista was a butcher. He was hated by the Cuban people. And the U.S. loved him, kissed him, hugged him, made nice with him, sent him aid, trained his Guardia Civile and all this sort of thing. What's the difference? What was the difference between Batista and Castro? The difference was that Batista was a cooperative dictator. What does that mean? It means that he opened up his country to U.S. interests. He says, come on in, boys. The tobacco industry here, the best in the world, right? Cuban tobacco, Cuban cigars. It's yours. The cotton industry, the sugar industry, the magnesium, the mining, the shell food, the tourist industry, big one, all yours. You guys come on in. You own it all, Yankees. You can have it. You can profit. And I keep my people down so that they work hard for less. And the less you have to pay them, the more there is for you. And all you got to do, though, is take care of me, my family, my brother Juan, my brother Jose, my cousin this and that. You give me my boodle. You train my police and paramilitary, and we'll take care of everything for you. And so it was a client-state relationship. So what you had was U.S. tax money going in there to make the world safe, to make Cuba safe for big U.S. investments. Even exporting some of our jobs there, by the way. I was looking at El Salvador. Do you know who's in El Salvador? ITT, General Motors, Firestone, Microsoft. I'm saying, what the hell's in El Salvador? I mean, there's just some bananas, some sugar. I mean, what are all these big companies doing in El Salvador? Well, they've gone in there, they've gone in there for that other resource. That other resource which adds value to any production and gives you your profit. That other resource which is called labor. They go down for the labor. And you have Salvadorians making energy rods, rubber tires, automobile parts, name it, everything. So there go our jobs. Our jobs are being exported. Now, I don't begrudge other people getting jobs in the industrial world, but first of all, they're not getting decent pay, but not when it's at the expense of people who have been fighting to get a higher standard of economic democracy. I think they give you a glass or something. It looks kind of undignified, doesn't it? Slugging it. Hey, so how am I doing so far? Okay, yeah? That's good. All right, so another goal is not only to prevent competing forms of capital, such as socialist or collectivist or communitarian or whatever else, and that's where the pattern has been generally. You attack those authoritarian countries that are trying any kind of distributive politics. Iraq is a very fascinating example, but I'm going to get to that in a minute. But you also support certain democracies if they are free market democracies, and you attack democracies also that might be trying to redistribute things. Salvador Allende's crime in Chile was he did not interfere with anybody's democratic rights. Not any newspaper, not any radio station, not any demonstration, whatever else. What he did do is he started to interfere with certain economic rights, ITT and the big copper industry, and he started saying, this should be publicly owned. We got to take some of this money, spend less of it on the military, more on people, more on building up clinics, schools, neighborhood industries, and the like. And that's when they hit him. He wasn't like Batista. He didn't say, come on in, boys, it's all yours. He did say, we need a minimum wage. If you come in, you've got to pay our workers a decent wage, etc., etc. And corporations really generally don't like that, you see. If you're a head of a corporation, you always have this problem that your workers and others want to spend money on really stupid things. Stupid things like wages, pensions, healthcare plans, paid holidays, sick leave, environmental protections, occupational safety. When will it end? Stupid things. Every dollar I got to spend on stupid things like that is one less dollar I can put in my pocket or give to my stockholders. And so Allende was troublesome and he had to be done in. Don't believe me? Listen to Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of State. He said if you got to choose between democracy and the economy, you go for the economy. He said that. I thought it was nice. I mean, every so often they get a little close to the truth. You know, oh, look at that. Henry almost said something that was true. The other thing U.S. policy is dedicated to now is not only to stop competing forms of capital, as in Libya with Gaddafi, who is turning Libya. There's another case. Libya was run by dictators before. U.S. loved them. Gaddafi came in with his colonels, took over the country. He took over a social structure that was like Saudi Arabia, that is where a fraction of 1%, obscenely rich, owned everything in Libya, got all the oil revenues, kicked them out, nationalized the oil industry, took the earnings from the oil industry and started doing things like reforestation. Libyan people were allowed to go to school, free education for the first time in their history, free medical care, so forth and so on, doing those kinds of things. That's not what the world should be about. The world is not to be organized to benefit that 95, 98%. It's organized to benefit that 2 or 3% at the top. Okay, in addition, U.S. policy we're now seeing is also dedicated to preventing competing formations of capital, not competing capital forms. You get the difference? With, let's say, a socialist or collectivist society would be a competing capital form. But it's also now dedicated to stopping competing formations of capitalism. That makes it clearer. Competing formations of capitalism. Not only competing forms, but within the global capitalist sphere itself. One of the problems with the third world is not that people are stupid or lazy or poor or can't do anything. In fact, the opposite is that people were developing, and they were developing their industries. You know, you used to get, certain countries in Africa, you used to get raw leather hides from them, and then before you know it, you got conditioned, finished leather, and then before you know it, you started getting leather goods. purses, shoes, and all this sort of thing. Hey, we don't want that. We don't want those things competing with us. Now, for a while, they were allowing that. Much of the third world was getting some aid. There was the feeling that, well, we need to develop some level of prosperity, otherwise these people will go communist, and we can't have that. So, what do? We give them some aid and all that sort of thing, and we look out for U.S. interests too. But then suddenly something happened. The communist countries were overthrown. The Soviet Union was overthrown and that sort of thing. And there was a big celebration which said, we won. We've won. There is no alternative system. It's going to be global capitalism from now on. Shortly after that, a rather querulous note began to be injected in conservative magazines and publications, and it went like this. It says, we now have Eastern Europe going into a free market system. And that meant, the end of pensions, the end of minimum wages, the end of wage guarantee, of job guarantees, the end of all those things. A tremendous climb in crime, homelessness, poverty, prostitution, beggary, and the like, all through Russia, Ukraine, Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and now Yugoslavia. Why don't we do rollback here too? That is, the whole idea is to really oppose competing formations of capitalism. If I can undo your system, privatize it and deindustrialize it and really impoverish it, that elevates the value of my capital. I don't have to worry about your prosperity anymore. There's no Soviet Union for you to get competing aid from. I don't have to worry about it. The world is ours. So what we've had now is a rollback. Wipe out the economy, flood its markets with underpriced Western subsidized goods, privatize its industries, eliminate competing capitalist forms, eliminate non-profit public ownership. One thing that happened in Yugoslavia, the minute Milosevic was kicked out, was the Kostunica government came in and they put up for privatization 7,000 businesses. Worker-controlled businesses, worker-owned, community-controlled businesses, all of them put up for privatization. Most of privatization, by the way, ends up to be just deindustrialized. They buy it for garage sale and then they just put it out of business or put it in mothballs. A very good case is Saddam Hussein. It's Iraq. Saddam Hussein was CIA. He came in, he was working with the CIA to destroy the Iraqi revolution, which he did. He destroyed the Kurdish Independent Party. He destroyed he destroyed the left wing of his own Ba'athist party. He destroyed the Communist Party. He destroyed all that. He was the CIA's boy. Then he did something that got rather annoying. Because now the ante is up. Now it's no longer, okay, sure, help your people do this, that, but make sure you have private capital, because we've got to watch out for the Russians. We don't want you to go socialist. No, he's not going to go socialist, but he's a competing capitalist form. He's doing something else. He's doing development. He started training engineers and a whole technological and professional class in Iraq. Iraq had the highest standard of living in the Middle East. He was looking for a better deal on the oil prices. He was getting uppity about the oil prices and standing up to the U.S. and the West and that sort of thing. And he had to be dealt with. How is he dealt with? First of all, the same way that Noriega was dealt with, the same way Gaddafi was dealt with, the same way Milosevic is dealt with. You demonize him. You talk about what a demon he is, and that gives you license then to bomb and attack his people. So this is what I think we have before us. And I think now we've explained a mystery. Why, after half a century of Western investment and aid, the third world is not better off, but poorer. It's poorer than it's ever been before. The number of people living in poverty throughout the world is growing at a faster rate than the world's population. And the world's population is growing at quite a pace, isn't it? Poverty is spreading as wealth grows and accumulates. The goal of Western investment is not to develop competing formations of capitalism or capital, but to advance the profits of capital accumulation of Western investors. The relationship between wealth and poverty is not just a juxtaposition. We often say, look at all this wealth here and look at all this poverty here. Isn't this terrible? Like it's just an unfortunate happenstance. In fact, that's not just a juxtaposition, but a dynamic interrelation. Wealth creates poverty. That's how you get poverty, by accumulating wealth. The way you get the rich slave owner living in such luxury on those gorgeous, glorious plantations is by having slaves and working them day and night. James Madison said that for every slave he had on his planet, James Madison, by the way, was a president of the United States. He was the 4th president of the United States. He said for every slave on his plantation, he reckoned he made $275 a year in profits, and it cost him only $24 to sustain that slave. So that's quite a profit. That's very good. And this is back in the days when, $275 could buy you Rhode Island or something. So, okay, you can't have feudal lords living in great castles unless you have serfs whose labor is being exploited. The expropriation, the surplus of their labor goes to the lords. And you can't have big, rich corporate transnational capitalists unless you have workers. So the world is, you see, divided into column A and column B. In column A are those people who live mostly off earnings from investments, dividends on stocks, interest on bonds, rents on properties, royalties on natural resources like oil well ownings, this sort of thing. And in column B are people who live mostly on wages, salaries, fees, commissions. Work, in other words. And what people in column A and column B have in common is that they both live off the labor of the people in column B. David Rockefeller, you can say, well, David Rockefeller, he's retired now, but he used to work. He was the head of Rockefeller Brothers. Yeah, he worked. He could work very hard, but that can't explain the immense wealth he was making. David Rockefeller will sit here for an hour with you, and he leaves this room. He's richer than when he walked in. Maybe not this week, but generally he is. You walk out here poor because that little bit of money you got in the bank has already gotten chewed up a little by inflation by now. People in column A make up less than 1% of the world's population. The rest of the people are in column B. Of course, there are many differences. There are people who can make more, who are prosperous, and so forth. But for the most part, everybody still has to keep working. And that policy, the policy and the class that George Bush represents is the people in column A. And none of that benefit trickles down to us. When Nike closes down U.S. jobs in Ohio, where they're paying people $18, $20 an hour of benefits and everything else, and he moves to Indonesia, where they're paying people 18 cents an hour, Nike does that, and it's not for give you a better deal. They still come back and sell those shoes at what, $120, $130, $200, right? So the goal of those who control, I'm going to end it right here, the goal of those who control the land, labor, capital, technology, and resources of this society and most of the world, the goal is to get us back to 1870. That is, the goal is to get us back to an impoverished population where the labor unions have been broken, where there's no minimum wage law, where there's no child labor laws, where people work harder and harder for less and less. The harder they can get you to work, the poorer they can make you, then the harder you will work for less and less. You might ask yourself, why is it Americans won't work for 18 cents an hour the way those Indonesians do? Is it because we're so much more self-respecting? Is that it? No American would take a job for 18 cents an hour. No, it's because we're no longer in 1870. We've had a century of democratic struggle, of organizing in the workplace, of fighting for a better life, a better size of the pie. And the goal is always relentlessly by those who think the pie was given to them by God, and they don't have to give anybody a crumb or a slice. The goal is to get us back to 1870. In other words, the United States was a third world country 100 years before the term third world country was ever coined. In 1870, we had child labor, we had mass poverty, we had typhoid epidemics in Philadelphia and Baltimore, we had mass unemployment, we had people living in desperation, prostitution, beggary, big time. We had a few people in obscene wealth, obscene riches, and the mass of the people struggling with a very small middle class just hanging on by its bleeding fingers. That is their goal, to get back to that, where they can write the tickets, where they are not bothered by people who are trying to constantly better their lives at the expense of those who own it all. The thing about the difference between the struggle between the haves and the have-nots, the haves are really the have-it-alls. They want it all. They want to bring back 14-hour workdays. They want no social services. They say that. With GATT and WTO and NAFTA and FTAA, which is now pending, the goal is to eliminate public services. Any public service will now be considered an infringement and interference with the private market, a lost business opportunity, and the public, whatever it is, the municipality, the state government, or the federal government, would have to pay some imaginary loss compensations to any corporation that's in that particular line of business. No social services, no social benefits. They say that. They don't want Social Security. They're nibbling at it. They can't come right out and say, let's get rid of the whole thing, which is what they want to do. It doesn't work. Instead, they tell us it doesn't work. It's going to go bankrupt. It's going to go so bankrupt that it's got an $80, $100, $200 billion surplus, and they're dipping into it. He's eager. Bush is eager to dip into that Social Security and spend it on more arms, more guns, more satellites, more outer space missiles, more aircraft carriers, all of which are going to stop a terrorist with a little ceramic knife, aren't they? As they've done so brilliantly so far. So they're still fighting against the 8-hour day. They're still fighting against occupational safety. They call it bureaucratic interference. They're still fighting to destroy and roll back labor unions, and they're doing a very good job of that. Half a century ago, 35% of our workforce was unionized. Today it's down to something like 13%. They're still fighting against public health programs, against public education, against disability insurance and old age pensions. So what we need then is a global anti-imperialist movement. There is a U.S. empire, and we have to oppose it. And we got to point out that the patriotic thing is to have a government. This is our flag too. The patriotic thing is to have a government that works for the interests of the people in column B, and not for the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Mellons, the Huntington Hartfords, the Bill Gateses, and the others in column A. We not only need an anti-imperialist movement, we already have one. We saw it in Seattle against the WTO, in Washington, D.C. against the IMF and the World Bank, in Prague, in Quebec City, in Sydney, Australia, in Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Genoa. They call us agitators, but I have another word for it. When people get out and they mobilize and they demand a change and they expose an issue and they confront that issue and they offer an alternative, they call us agitators. I have another word for it. I call that democracy. Democracy, and let's have more of it. Thank you. Do you have questions? A few.
If you will, yes.
Yeah, I'll do some questions. There's a question I know someone's going to ask. What about the terrorists? What do we do about that? Does anybody want to ask that question? What?
Can you go into details about U.S. involvement in Afghanistan?
Well, the first intervention in Afghanistan wasn't the Soviet Union. It was Pakistan and the U.S. They went in. There was a military officers' revolt against the right wing. The military officers were leftists. That means leftists or people who did things like wanting to educate children and women in Afghanistan, wanting land reform and such. The Mujahideen tribe did not like that idea. The big landowners didn't like that idea. The Pakistani military didn't like that idea. So there was this fight. The left military around Kabul and a few other places was heavily besieged. They repeatedly called for the Soviet Union to come in. The Soviets reluctantly, by the way, refused the first several overtures, did come in and got themselves involved in a proxy war against the U.S. and the CIA, lost it, went out. The country was taken over by a Mujahideen government. The opium production went up tremendously. That was another thing with the left officers and the Soviets, is they interfered with a very profitable Soviet, with a very profitable heroin trade coming out of Afghanistan. Some of the, quote, best heroin in the world comes from that region. In fact, most of it comes from that region through Europe into the U.S., into Europe too, and other places. Heroin production's up again, the Mujahideen are back in, and then suddenly there emerges another group called the Taliban. Supposedly they're college students. Yeah, right. They're college students who had a whole infrastructure, had the best arms there were, had communication, transportation, striking power, organization, and money. It turns out they were financed by the CIA. The most retrograde element has taken over in Afghanistan, and so you now have a Frankenstein monster in a way. That is, you have a creation of the West that now is less than friendly. The Taliban actually is saying, well, we want to negotiate with you. You know, we're not going to invade your country or attack your country. Don't attack our country. There is a way to stop terrorism. Bombing Afghanistan, a country which has been ravaged by war for the last 10 years, killing these people, these herdsmen, these tribesmen. You're not going to get, you know, they bombed. The U.S. has been bombing Iraq for now 11 years. They haven't scratched Saddam Hussein once. He hasn't missed a meal yet. He has slept in a warm, clean bed every night. You killed an awful lot of other beautiful people. I can tell Mr. Bush that, and they're still doing it. So go bomb some hillsides in Afghanistan with the super missiles, kill bunches of people. You now have hundreds of thousands of people fleeing in terror. There's terror at work already. And this is causing even greater starvation, greater dislocation, greater sickness, illnesses. When populations just start moving like that, there's no productivity going on. So it's gotten terrible. If we want to stop terrorism, then we should not, or the U.S. leaders should not try to be owning and controlling the planet. That's why we're so hated. I mean, you could have a country that has a foreign policy that pushes for international agreements, for cooperation. Why don't we respect the nuclear freeze? Why don't we sign on to the landmines bill to stop the landmining thing? Why don't we stop the race of armaments into outer space? These are some of the things you can do. Why don't we start respecting the economic development in other countries and the cultural, economic, social, cultural, religious development in other countries? And pointedly say we extend the hand of friendship, that your development and well-being and prosperity is not a threat to us. It's something that you have every right to. And if General Motors next year doesn't make $5 billion in profits because now Yugoslavia, you've made your own car and you've cut into the profits, when they're going to make only $4.9 billion in profits, or even $4 billion or $3 billion, that's General Motors' problem. But as I say, the prosperity and development of other countries does not detract from our own prosperity. The poverty in other countries does not add to our prosperity, as I gave with the example of Nike, as I gave with the example of what happens to labor in El Salvador. But that would be the way to be a country in partnership, rather than being a country that's the almighty one that says we can go in anywhere, we can tell any country what they should do and what they shouldn't do, and if they don't do it, we'll bomb the stuffing out of them. Who gives these leaders in Washington the right to do that and dictate? You see, and this is it. The U.S. Congress in this orgasm, this orgy of. This orgy, it's like an orgasm, everybody's screaming, of patriotism. Orgy is bad enough. Orgy of patriotism turns around and votes 420 to 1, votes total power to President Bush. Says, we give you the power to pursue all-out war against any nation, any organization or movement or individual as you so choose. You know, you can get up and you can say, I have special information, I can't reveal it, but it's coming in Marseille, I'm going to bomb Marseille. He wouldn't do that because France would be, all of Europe would be horrified and all that. But that's what it comes down to. And of course there are, in fact, some of U.S. allies are saying, oh, wait a minute, who appointed him king of the world? Wait a minute, he has absolute total power now to go bomb, intercede, attack anywhere. You know, I mean, some of these European countries have investments and such in Middle East and Africa and all that, and they don't particularly want to see their pharmaceutical factories get bombed and their chemical plants and whatever else. So that's not the way to do it. You know, when Ronald Reagan sent those Marines into Lebanon, and the French, there were 3 contingents went into Lebanon. U.S. Marines, French soldiers, and Italian soldiers, the Bersaglieri, the elite unit, went in. Sometime later, 5 Marines were killed over a period of a week and a half from sniper shots. Then a suicide truck with explosives went right into the Marine compound and exploded, and 183 Marines were killed. So altogether, that's 188 killed. Another suicide car that very same time went into the French compound and killed a large number of French soldiers, too. The Italian compound wasn't touched. And I wondered about that, why that was so. And sometime later, I met a Lebanese friend who was very involved politically. I said, how is it you didn't hit the Italian compound? And you know, the president of Italy at that time was a guy named Pertini. He was a socialist. He had been a partisan fighter against the Nazis in World War II. And he was very popular. He was known as the people's president. He was very much liked. He did a lot of good things. He sent those troops into Lebanon, but with a different mandate. He said, don't go in as conquerors, go light, and develop good relations with the people. The Italians, this Lebanese friend said to me, well, they were wonderful. This is not to say Italians are so wonderful compared to other ethnic groups. I'm not into that, even though I am Italian and have a lot of ethnic pride. This is a story I do like telling, though. Anyway, he said they put up field hospitals, they put up clinics, they helped the people in Lebanon. People came in who hadn't seen a doctor in their lives, you know. They got all this kind of help, and they did all sorts of things like that, assisting the population. So these mad, crazy, bestial, insane terrorists apparently can make discriminations, you see. You got to ask yourself, why are they targeting the U.S.? Why don't they target Denmark? They just want to be evil and kill people. Why don't they target Denmark as a free society, democratic society, and it's wide open. Security measures in Denmark don't even compare to the U.S. Why don't they target Sweden? I'll give you a soft target. Why don't they hit Luxembourg? I bet we could take out Luxembourg. Why don't they go in there and hit them? Why don't they do that? Why didn't they hit that Italian military compound? But they did hit the French and American ones. If you act like a conqueror, you're going to be hated as a conqueror. If you act as a friend and partner, then there's room for cooperation and work and negotiation. But if you act as a friend and and the partner, then you're not serving the Fortune 500 anymore, and that might be a problem. So it's time for us to really become politically aware of this fact. Do not believe anything they tell you. I mean, some of it may be true, but that's the problem. Always ask yourself, is this true? How true? What does he mean? What's the part of the story I'm not hearing? And look to alternative sources. It would be at this point that I might plug my books, but I won't do that. By the way, History as Mystery and To Kill a Nation are already published. They've been out for about a year and a half. Any other questions? I'm sorry, my answers tend to be very long, you know. Yes, miss. Yes. Yeah.
Dr. Hardy, could you speak to the United States' lack of involvement in the Rwandan genocide? Why are they not intervening in that?
Well, again, I do believe that the Liberation Army that was coming in was a Tutsi army, but it really made a point that we're not tribal. Any Hutu or Tutsi can be in this army. We want ethnic. It had all the aura of a liberation army. It had all the aura of a nationalist, self-determining army that was going to take its country and use its resources and its land for its own development. It had a lot of support among the Tutsi population, and so the Hutu were incited on the Tutsi. By the way, Hutu had some grievances because the Tutsi, don't forget what happened in Burundi, is that? What? Burundi, I pronounced it right. Burundi, where the Tutsi had slaughtered the Hutu. So you had the Hutu, and machetes were being brought in by the load-fills. Where did they come from? They came from someplace else than Rwanda. They came from the West. Bill Clinton explicitly prohibited the use of the word genocide in regard to Rwanda, even though it was a genocide. I mean, it was a systematic killing of all the Tutsi. And I think it was for the very reason I said. It was the same reason why the French military came into Rwanda and stopped that Tutsi army and stopped them from stopping the massacres that was going on, and looked the other way when the massacres were going on. They were complicit with it. It was a final solution against a troublesome population that was becoming political and politicized and critical of the West and wanting to claim its country for itself. That's not, I mean, there's a lot more about Rwanda that we would have to talk about, which I can't, just 1 minute. Yes?
Since democracy has to function on critical thought, and since critical thought has to be informed, and we rely so much on the news media for information, could you comment, as you've written before, on the corporate control of the news media and how that functions to limit true democratic critical thought?
I've written a book about it called Inventing Reality, which came out 2 years before Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, and it was it shows I have case studies of it. It shows that the news is pretty much a highly processed product, and it's in accordance with those who own the organization. That the people who write or speak for the media know who they're working for. And these news media are all big, giant multinational corporations. Times, Warner, NBC's, they're all owned by big companies. Disney, Westinghouse. Actually, the ownership keeps changing and combining so quickly. There used to be, Bagdigian points out, there used to be 24 major news cartels around the world, and then it was down to 15, and now it's down to about 7, and it's going to be down to more like 5 pretty soon. So the big corporations, and so, you got to... I thought with this whole World Trade tragedy of last week, the news media was not just a lapdog, the mouthpiece for power, they call it. Whatever the officialdom says, they send it out, and that's that. I thought they actually started clearing the way, which is what an ideological worker is also supposed to do, I guess. They were jumping in. They were saying things before the politicians ever dared to say. They're saying, this is war. You know who first said that? Tom Brokaw. He said it at about 9:45. I mean, the two planes hit, or maybe it was 10:30. I don't know, when the building came down. He was saying, this is war. This is war. War has started. This is a war that's started. And so they were getting that word out already, you know. This is evil. This is something that, this has never happened. This is the worst atrocity in the history of humanity. Well, I don't know. I wish it was, but I think there are others that have been much, much worse. Worst act of terrorism. Certainly it's the worst act of terrorism that we have ever endured on U.S. soil. And that's gotten people all upset. Yes, your hand was up next, sir.
I'm not in this class, but I went to this school in 1942, and then in 43, 44, and 45, I went off to protect freedom of speech, and I see that I won.
Well, thank you.
Now, was that a good war?
World War II? Yeah, I think it was a good war to stop fascism and stop Nazism. It took a bit of doing.
I got to the concentration camps, and I knew it was.
Yeah, well, that's what Eisenhower said to some of his troops. He says, now you know what you're fighting for. Look at these concentration camps. Well, there's no such thing as a good war. Of course, you know, Benjamin Franklin said the only good war is the war that's prevented or never fought. And World War II could have been prevented if we had been firmer, if we had listened. There were very strong elements in Germany, in the German military. There were any number of attempts on Hitler's life, not just that one time. And they had made overtures to the British intelligence service. We'll knock them out. We'll take them out. We'll even put in a conservative government. They knew who they were dealing with. We'll put in a conservative government, but we don't want this guy because this is going to mean another world war, and it will mean the destruction of Germany. The German generals knew it, and it was right. Of course, he got most of them and purged them and killed most of them. Yeah, well, when it came, yeah, guys like you, we all owe you something.
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech, and I'm using it.
That's right.
I didn't want to go to waste. You put your blood, sweat, and tears into it. I think the lady next to you had her hand up first. You know.
Are aware that there is some kind of U.S. injustice in the war against Iraq, and many people are very troubled about the Palestinian situation. I don't think Americans are truly ignorant of what the U.S. is doing. And I'm wondering why there's not more resistance. You know, the Vietnam War was all over the TVs when I was in college, and the Iraqi war surprisingly in CNN actually showed officers of bombing Baghdad and then was length going off. That was unusual, but why isn't the American public taking responsibility for the measures for the American government?
Well, I really do think that most Americans do not know of the U.S. role in Indonesia, in all these different countries that I talked about. I really don't think they have most of that information. If you have information indicating otherwise, that I would like to see it. I do know that despite the monopoly propaganda barrage that they're hit with, you do get some very unusual statistics. Like on Iraq, a few weeks before Bush went in on Iraq, the polls showed that Americans, by very large majorities, preferred a negotiated withdrawal to get Saddam Hussein to take his troops out of Kuwait, as opposed to sending U.S. forces to attack. Now, Bush didn't want to hear that at all, and he was pumping up one reason after another. Every day they were coming up with another reason why they had to go in. Babies were being torn from incubators in Kuwait. The Iraqi soldiers, remember, 500 babies torn from incubators and thrown on the floors of the Iraqis, laughing. And then people suddenly said, 500 premature babies in incubators. What is all of Los Angeles County has only 45 incubators. What is it? What is it? Kuwait specialized in premature babies? What is this? But these atrocity stories were up and all that sort of thing. And then once the troops went in, then what happens is the other jingoism kicks in. It's support our troops, the flags get waved, and all that sort of thing. But remember, George the First, when he was bombing Iraq and killing all those people, and Congress was calling him, passing resolutions, praising him for his unerring leadership, courage and fortitude, and so forth, his approval rating was 93%. And within a year, he lost the election to a mediocre governor from Arkansas, you see. So it doesn't mean anything. George II, his approval rating has gone from something like 32% up to 80% the way he's handling this. But it's a craze. There's just so long you can keep hyping, flag waving, and beeping your horn, USA, USA, USA. After a while, you got to live, and living means facing certain realities, how things are really going. So, I am rather discouraged by the extent to which I've seen this again and again, how leaders can be easily demonized. I remember when Omar Gaddafi of Libya, this was years ago, was Gaddafi. There was a Gaddafi, the demon Gaddafi. And I'd go around and people were Gaddafi. I'd go lecturing around the country. People, what about Gaddafi? Gaddafi going to get your mama. Gaddafi, And I'd say, Gaddafi, what is Gaddafi going to do? He's got a little ragtag. Here's a nation of 3 million people, and they'd actually convinced people in our country that this guy was a mortal danger to the security and survival of the United States, with an army of 50,000. What is he going to do with a ragtag army of 50,000? And he had manifested no interest in having hostile relations with the U.S. He repeatedly made overtures. I would like to negotiate a friendly position with the U.S. And instead, he was targeted and bombed, and his little daughter was killed in a terrorist attack by U.S. planes. You see, when the U.S. planes come in with jets, that's called a raid. That's not called a terrorist attack. People down there see it as a terrorist attack. It's the same thing in Palestine. The Palestinians are terrorists because they use cars and machine guns or whatever else, and the Israelis are retaliating with jets and tanks, and that's seen as retaliation. That's not seen as a terror attack, but it's using terror too. And then the same thing with Noriega, and then the same thing with Saddam Hussein, who is a slime ball, but for the wrong reasons. I think they were attacking him and killing his people. And then we heard about Milosevic. And now we're hearing it about Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden was again trained, equipped by the CIA. He and his cohorts were used in the CIA war in Afghanistan against the Afghan revolutionary government. And now he's turned around and he's gone into business for himself. Let's have just one more question, because I know you folks want to. Well, maybe we should make it 2 more questions, one here and one there, because I see you jumping up. I know. Okay, yeah, yes, go ahead. I'll try to give shorter answers.
I'm concerned in the effort to bolster our domestic security, civil liberties will be lost. Can you comment on that? Especially for certain groups.
Well, that was a very good example of the media moving ahead, not being the responsive lapdog to officialdom, but jumping and putting all these things out there and clearing the way so that the politicians could feel snug and safe to say those things. The media was saying that. You heard people saying, well, we have the luxury of democracy, and maybe it's a luxury we can't afford as much as we have, or we've taken democracy for granted, but maybe we shouldn't take it for granted too much anymore because we're going to have to do with less of it, or our civil liberties. They're saying those sort of things. Yeah, I think they will if they can whip up enough hysteria, they will target political dissenting groups. One of the groups they're going to target are the anti-globalization activists, and see them as terrorists and use the term against them as purveyors of violence and all that sort of thing. These a handful of these young people dressed in black, smashing a window in a Starbucks or a Gap store is called terrorism and violence. It's really just a deliberate systematic destruction of corporate property as a form of political protest. Nobody was getting hit or something. The police, meanwhile, coming in Genoa, you know, Berlusconi's Carabinieri, fascist little pigs, were going in and bloodying people in their sleeping bags and beating the hell out of them in the middle of the night. That wasn't called violence, and killing one demonstrator, as you know. This is why we have to stay alert to this whole question about civil liberties, and the best way to protect your freedom is to exercise it vigorously. That's the best way. As with the physical body, so with the body politic. The way to keep your body politic, to keep your community, your democracy strong, and to get whatever little democracy we do have, voting for this one or that one, but it's to exercise dissent vigorously and fearlessly. To keep yourself quiet, to quiet down, because I don't want to talk now, is to do the work of your enemies. You're silencing yourself before they even have to lift the finger to silence you. Yeah.
Sorry, questions I have is points of view. First of all, when whole countries, the companies like Microsoft come into the country and set up and then people are working there, we're actually doing a country a favor. People like to save up, but can't do that. Also,
Well, let me answer that before you go through your shopping list. Before you go through the shopping list. That's not necessarily true. You know, people who work in these countries at subsistence wages, like the maquiladoras in Mexico, are not all that particularly happy with the kinds of jobs and the conditions of the jobs. And the 17-year-old, 16-year-old girls who are working in the Nike factories in Indonesia do not like and love us. There isn't really any evidence of that. But of course, if you compare that kind of miserable 12-hour underpaid job to nothing, then yeah, it's better. If you're going to give me the choice between nothing and immediate starvation, or a job where I might be able to scratch through a little bit of something for 12-hour days, 6-7 days a week, I might have to take that job. But I'm not really sure that this gives them a love for us. That's not my impression.
also the difference between America and other countries is that America goes through procedures before they form anyone to do anything. They don't go about doing anything once. And that's the reason why countries don't like what they say. And the reason why they form USA and Denmark is because Denmark lets the countries do anything they want. USA will say no stop. There's human rights, there's this, there's that. And that's the reason why they form USA and
Well, I gave a whole lecture to the contrary, but you certainly are entitled to your opinion. I hope you might give it some critical examination. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention.
Basically, yes, you guys can all go home now. Those of you who are interested in expressing an alternative viewpoint of some kind like that, keep in mind the product of this particular presentation, lecture, and whatnot is one that has been actually critically researched. And so if you hold an alternative point of view, it's of course under free speech acceptable, but come at us with your research, not just simply your passion. So other than that, thank you. Thank you very much. Anyone who might be in Ava Mo's classroom and is looking for their credit, Ava Mo's classroom, here you go. Here's your sign-up sheet.
The lecture series would not really be happening at all if I had not provided the space, much funding, and a lot of publicity, many things. So I want to express my gratitude towards MassArt for helping make this happen. Also, the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities has provided a lot of funds for this as well. If you guys, before I forget to ask you, I don't know if I've already asked this, but there's audience evaluation forms. If you could fill those out and just leave them in the box out there when you leave, that would be great. And I'd like to thank specific individuals who have helped me along the way. George Creamer has done a lot to assist me and help me figure out how this is going to come together as a whole. Lisa Tong as well. Both of them have provided like a lot of financial assistance as well as organizational guidance and that sort of thing. Ricardo Barreto in the Urban Arts Institute. All of the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities staff has been very helpful. Linda Seavey and Johanna Branson. Michelle First and Darlene Gillian, they're the ones who basically got all this information out to everybody in the public so they can know about this series. My friend Sheldon Swartz, who designed the website, and Rick McDermott and Jack Fahey, who have helped me organize the space and help me with technical assistance. So I guess I'd just like to say that tonight we are lucky to have internationally recognized historian and playwright tell us what he thinks the artist's role in affecting social change is. He is the author of several texts which actively engage non-academic audiences, including What is the Future of History and his famous A People's History of the United States, which is increased in sales every year since its first publication in 1980, almost 20 years ago. That's pretty much unheard of in the publishing industry. The importance of what he has to say is truly evident in the fact that, and I'm just going to read this here, his writings have been translated into Japanese, Italian, Serbo-Croatian, French, Spanish, Hindi, German, Finnish, Chinese, Korean, and Swedish. His plays have been performed in Boston, Washington, D.C., Chicago, San Francisco, London, Tokyo, and several other locations. I think that the most important thing to remember about Dr. Zen is that he's been a constant voice in presence in social and political activism that dates back to the first sit-ins in Atlanta, Georgia in 1960, protesting the exclusion of African Americans from being served in white restaurants, where he sat alongside others until they were all taken away and arrested. Many of those that I know, including my own mother, have had their understanding of American history and their understanding of what it means to be an American transformed by his writings and his actions, and are forever thankful. Last night I was talking to my best friend and I was saying, how am I going to introduce this guy? He's done so much. And basically what he said to me was, just say, here's one cool motherfucker, Howard Zinn.
Thank you. I've never been introduced that way. I hope you caught that on the video camera. Well, I have never talked about this topic. I won't say I've never talked, but I've never talked about this topic, the art and society. Of course, I've thought about it. My wife is a painter. I have artist friends. Some of my best friends are artists. Some of them are here, observing me. But as I say, yeah, I've thought about it. Of course, all of us have. And what comes to mind when I think of the relationship of the artist to society, what should be the relationship of the artist to society. And with me, it's always a question of what should be and not what is. you know, and but I think of the word transcendent, which is a word I've never used in public. But it was the only thing I could come up with to describe what I think about the role of the artist. And by that I mean, you know, not, you know, Immanuel Kant's, well, yes, sort of close to it, but not really, his idea of what is transcendent, something like it. But the idea is that the artist transcends the immediate, transcends the here and now. The artist, transcends the madness of the world, transcends the madness of terrorism, transcends the madness of war. And the artist thinks outside the framework and acts and paints and does music and writes outside the framework that society has created. And the artist is, you know, may do no more than, and I don't mean to minimize it by saying no more than, the artist may do more than, you know, give us beauty and laughter, passion, surprise, drama, and that's good. That is, the artist needn't apologize for just doing that, because in doing that, the artist is telling us what the world should be like, even if it isn't that way now. And the artist is taking us away from the moments of horror that we experience every day in this world, some days more than others, and showing us something else, showing us what is possible. But then, there's no need for an artist to apologize about just giving us something that is passionate and beautiful and funny, or any of those. No need to apologize for that. But there is more. As the artist can do more, yes, should do more. Not only that, but more. Because the artist is also a citizen, the artist is a human being. I mean, I face that in a different way, in that if I can be classified, well, yeah, the society classifies me. Say, I'm a historian. That scares me. To be classified, I'm a historian. You see. But I don't want to be just a historian. But the society disciplines us. It puts us into a discipline. You're a historian. You're a businessman. You're an engineer. You're a this. You're a that. And the first thing somebody asks you at a cocktail party is, what do you do? Which means, you know, what is your profession? What is your, you know, how are you categorized? And the problem is that people begin to think that that's what they are, and that's all they are, that they're professionals in something. And you hear the word professionalism being used, and people say, you've got to be professional. Whenever you hear the word, I get a little scared, because that limits human beings to working within the limits set by this, you know, profession. As a historian, I would face this, and there would be, during the Vietnam War, there would be meetings of historians. Can you imagine what a wonderful feeling that is? To be among 2,000 historians at a meeting. And I remember during the Vietnam War, the question was, at one of our great meetings of historians, the war was raging in Southeast Asia, and the question was, should historians take a stand on the war? And there was a big debate on this. Really? There's a big debate on this. And some of us, introduced a resolution saying, we historians think the United States should get out of Vietnam. A simple little thing. And then there were others who said, no, it's not that we don't think the United States should stay in Vietnam. It's not that at all. It's just that we're historians. It's not our business. Hey, whose business is it? So the historian says it's not my business, and the businessman says it's not my business, and the lawyer says it's not my business, and the artist says it's not my business, and whose business is it? You mean we're going to leave the business of the most important issues in the world to the people who run the country? I mean, how stupid can you be? I mean, haven't we had enough experience historically with leaving the important decisions to the people in the White House, or the people in Congress, or the people in the Supreme Court, or the people who dominate the economy? We've had lots of experience leaving the important decisions to them because the citizen doesn't know he's a citizen. He thinks he's only a doctor or a lawyer or a historian or an artist or whatever. But back in the 18th century, Rousseau said, I see all sorts of people who are doing this and doing that and doing this and doing that, but where are the citizens among us? Everybody must be involved. There are no experts. Well, there are. I remember during the Vietnam War, I keep going back because that's, there are certain historical moments when learning is more intense than at any other period. I mean, this is one of those moments, too, right now, after September 11th. But Vietnam was one of those moments when learning is compressed into a short span of time and place. And one of the things we learned about during those years was about experts, and about when the war started and people would ask questions, why are we there? I said, well, listen to the experts. The experts would get on television and tell us why we're there. And I remember the British actor, an artist, right? Actors are artists. The British actor, Peter Ustinov, spoke out against the war in Vietnam. And then somebody said, Ustinov, he's an actor. He's not an expert. And Ustinov replied, there are experts in little things, but there are no experts in big things. There are experts in this fact and that fact and that fact, but there are no moral experts. It's important to remember that all of us, whatever we do, have the right to make moral decisions about the world, and undeterred by the cries that will come up, oh, you don't know, you're not an expert. These people up there, they know. Well, it takes only a little bit of history to realize how dangerous it is to think that the people who run the country know what they're doing. So the word transcendent comes to mind when I think of the role of the artist in dealing with the issues of the day. And I use the word transcendent to suggest that the role of the artist is to transcend the given wisdom, to transcend the word of the establishment, to transcend the orthodoxy, to transcend, to go beyond, to escape what is handed down by the government, or what is said in the press, or what is said on television. Because there are people in the arts and people in other professions who think Yes, let's get involved. But let's get involved in the way we are told to be involved. And then you will see the artists and the other people in professions getting in line in the way that people are expected to get in line when the president says this is what we must do, and everybody else in politics echoes that, and this is what we must do. And we've seen this all around now. I mean, how many times have I read in the press since September 11th, we must be united. Now, what do they mean by that? I would like us to be united, but united around what? And when people say we must be united, most of the time when they say this, they are saying either explicitly or implicitly, we must be united around whatever the president tells us to do. Dan Rather, right? TV anchor, anchored to the establishment. Isn't that what an anchor man is? And Dan Rather gets up on national television and says, Bush is my president. When he says get in line, I get in line. Did any of you read that? Yes, he said it. I mean, I make up some things. But I didn't make that up, you see. And I thought, here's a very important, influential journalist. And he has forgotten the first rule of journalism, which is think for yourself. He's forgotten what that great journalist I.F. Stone, probably one of the several greatest journalists of the 20th century, what I.F. Stone used to say when he stopped working for the major media. He was working for regular newspapers, and then he realized he couldn't be himself. He couldn't say what he wanted to do. And so he established his own little newsletter, I.F. Stone's Weekly, which became famous for giving you things that you couldn't get anywhere else. And then I.F. Stone would be invited to speak to classes of journalism students. And he would say, I'm going to tell you a number of things, but you really only have to remember, if you really want to be a good journalist, you really only have to remember 2 words. Governments lie. Very important to remember. Governments lie. I mean, not just the American government. Governments in general lie. Now, when I say all governments lie, that may sound like an anarchist statement. The anarchists have something there. Yeah. They're right to be skeptical and suspicious of people who hold governmental power, because the tendency of people who hold governmental power is to lie in order to maintain that power. And rather, when he said that, the president says, get in line, I get in line, he violated that, Hippocratic oath of journalists that is implied in the profession of journalism, of think for yourself. The kind of statement you would expect from a journalist in a totalitarian state, not somebody living in a democracy. And then, talking about getting in line. And then you have Al Gore, who accepted his defeat graciously, so graciously that he became humble, overwhelmingly humble, so that when all this happened, Gore announced, Bush is my commander-in-chief. I thought, I don't think he's read the Constitution. The Constitution says that the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He's not the commander-in-chief of the country, of all of us, you see. But well, here are all these people rushing to get in line, rushing to get inside the perimeter, of power. And it's the job of the artist to transcend that, to think outside the boundaries, to dare to say things that no one else will say. Fortunately, we've had all through history artists who dared to do that. And I think of I think of Mark Twain. And here he was writing these great novels which everybody loved. The stories, a wonderful, wonderful storyteller. But when the United States went to war in 1898 against Spain, and then after a quick defeat of Spain, what was called a splendid little war, the United States went to war in the Philippines. That was not a splendid little war. That was a long and ugly war to subdue the Filipinos who wanted to run the Philippines themselves. A war which in its atrocities foretold the war in Vietnam. And Mark Twain became one of the voices speaking out against that war. And when Theodore Roosevelt, in 1906, and by then the war had been going on for 5 years, and there were several 100,000 Filipinos dead. Well, you will not find much in your history books about how many Filipinos died in that war. But in 1906, the U.S. Army committed a massacre in the Philippines. You might call it an act of terrorism, that is, in the sense that innocent people were simply mowed down by an army unit. And Theodore Roosevelt sent a message of congratulations to the general who carried out the operation against these Moros, these Muslims in the southern Philippines, who were virtually unarmed, who didn't know anything about modern warfare. Men, women, children, just all mowed down, every single one of them. And after Roosevelt congratulated the general for this great military victory, Mark Twain denounced Roosevelt for this and became one of the leading protesters against the war in the Philippines. He stepped out of his role as just a storyteller whom everybody loved and got into the fray and dared to say things that so many people in the country were not saying. And of course, people then questioned his patriotism. Because as soon as you speak outside the boundaries, as soon as you say things that are different than what the establishment is telling you to say, what the newspapers, what the media, and what everybody, including leading intellectuals, are telling you to say, as soon as you do that, the question of your patriotism arises. And Mark Twain said about patriotism and about loyalty, because people asked him, why aren't you loyal? He said, my kind of loyalty was loyalty to one's country, not to its institutions or its office holders. The country is the real thing, the substantial thing, the eternal thing. It is the thing to watch over and care for and be loyal to. Its institutions are extraneous. They are its mere clothing, and clothing can wear out, become ragged, cease to be comfortable, cease to protect the body from winter, disease, and death. To be loyal to rags, to shout for rags, to worship rags, to die for rags, that is a loyalty of unreason. This is important because in the present discussion, boundaries have been set. lines have been drawn, and people who go outside those boundaries and dare to criticize official policy are called unpatriotic, and disloyal. And when they say that, when they accuse dissenters of that, they have forgotten the meaning of loyalty and the meaning of patriotism. Patriotism does not mean support for your government. Patriotism means support for your country, as Mark Twain said. Or as Emma Goldman said, roughly around the same time. Emma Goldman, the feminist anarchist, said, she gave a lecture on patriotism, and she said, I love the country, but I don't love the government. And to criticize the government when you think the government is wrong is the highest act of patriotism. And when somebody accuses you, I don't know if you will all face that situation, but if somebody accuses you of not being patriotic because you don't go along with whatever the government is doing, I think you ought to remind them about the Declaration of Independence. And that according to the Declaration of Independence, and everybody praises the Declaration of Independence when it's hung up on a classroom wall, but not when people read it and understand it. During the Vietnam War, a soldier was disciplined for putting up the Declaration of Independence on his barracks wall. But the Declaration of Independence says that governments are artificial creations. They're set up by people, by the people of the country. Governments are set up by the people of the country to achieve certain things, certain objectives. The equality of all people in their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments are artificial creations set up for those purposes, and when a government becomes destructive of those ends, as the Declaration said, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. That's serious. But that is democratic doctrine. That is the idea of democracy. And therefore, there are times when it becomes absolutely patriotic to point a finger at the government and say, the government is not doing what it should be doing to safeguard the right of people to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I don't think it would be wrong in our time, with everybody talking, oh, this is one world, globalization, yes, the world has shrunk, we're all part of the same planet. I mean, they talk that way, but do they mean it? You could test out whether they mean it by suggesting that the words of the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, and property, apply not only to people in this country, but to people in other countries, to people everywhere. People everywhere in the world have the same right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so when the government becomes destructive of that, well, then it is patriotic to criticize, to oppose the government, to become a dissenter, to do what we always praised when it was done in other countries, in totalitarian countries, and we looked upon the dissenters and the critics of those governments as heroes for daring to speak out. And I wanted to point to some other artists who spoke out against war. E.E. Cummings. I sing of Olaf, glad and big, whose warmest heart recoiled at war, a conscientious objector. But though all kinds of officers, I'm skipping a little. But though all kinds of officers, the yearning nation's blue-eyed pride, their passive prey did kick and curse, until for wear their clarion voices and boots were much the worse, and egged the first-class privates on his rectum wickedly to tease by means of skillfully applied bayonets, roasted hot with heat, Olaf, upon what were once knees, does almost ceaselessly repeat, there is some shit I will not eat. And Eugene O'Neill, the great playwright, and this was 6 months after Pearl Harbor. This is important because E. Cummings was reacting to World War I, and other writers were reacting to World War I, because that great martial spirit that was summoned up in 1917 when they were getting the United States into war, and when they were marshaling people into line, and the flag was being waved, and then the war was over, and people looked at the 10 million dead on the battlefields of Europe and asked, what was this all about? And then the disillusionment began to arise, and people began to think again. Because after that first wave of flag waving and bugles blowing and we got to do this, and look at the terrible things they did, and and terrible things were being done. And so therefore we have to do terrible things. That's war. War is terrible things done on one side and terrible things done on the other side. And then after a while the second thoughts come, there are all these people dead, and what did we accomplish? What have we done? And that's what happened after World War I. That's what led to the writings of John Dos Passos and Ernest Hemingway and Ford Madox Ford, and that great novel, that great anti-war novel by Dalton Trumbo, Johnny Got His Gun, which I recommend to all of you. You can read it in one evening, and you won't forget it. But it's good to remember that, even when the war is presumably a good war, because wars always look good at the beginning. They always look good at the beginning to a lot of people, because this rush of fervor based on something terrible that has been done and something that must be done in retaliation. And then only later does the thinking begin and the questioning begin. And so Eugene O'Neill was writing 6 months after Pearl Harbor, and writing when the country was being mobilized for war. And remember, this is the good war. You know, there are good wars and bad wars. I used to think so, until I was in a war. I thought, no, there are no such thing as good wars and bad wars. I had a student once who wrote on her paper, wars are like wines. They're good years and bad years, good wars and bad years. But she said, war is not like wine. War is like cyanide. One drop and you're dead. But Eugene O'Neill is writing in the midst of that early burst of war fervor after Pearl Harbor. So not an easy time to write this, but he wrote this to his son. It is like acid always burning in my brain that the stupid butchering of the last war taught men nothing at all, that they sank back listlessly on the warm manure pile of the dead and went to sleep, indifferently bestowing custody of their future, their fate, into the hands of state departments, whose members are trained to be conspirators, card sharps, double-crossers, and secret betrayers of their own people, into the hands of greedy capitalist ruling classes, so stupid they could not even see when their own greed began devouring itself. in the hands of that most debased type of pimp, the politician, and that most craven of all lice and job worshippers, the bureaucrats. Well, I mean, I would never use such strong language myself. But I'm willing to quote it when somebody else says it. No. And when I talk about thinking outside the boundaries